At a time when most African economies were sinking under debt and insecurity, one country broke the pattern. Burkina Faso recorded an unexpected 6.3% growth and a historic trade surplus, while others struggled to survive. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the nation that once depended on aid turned crisis into momentum, balancing expansion with the lowest inflation in years. Yet behind those numbers lies a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about power, resilience, and the future of Africa. They told you that Burkina Faso's success was just luck, but the truth runs deeper. You're about to hear what few reports dared to show, how a nation under siege built stability from within. You'll walk away understanding why this 6.3% growth is rewriting Africa's economic logic. And this isn't a story for those who listen casually. Because if you stop here, you'll never see what really drives Ibrahim Traoré's transformation, or how missing it means misunderstanding the new balance of power in West Africa. The first clue appeared quietly, a set of numbers that refused to fit the narrative. In 2025, while most of West Africa slowed or contracted, Burkina Faso's economy grew 6.3%, its inflation dropped to 1.8%, and its trade balance flipped from a 466 billion CFA deficit to a 1.63 billion CFA surplus. What began as a fragile economy under siege suddenly stood out as one of the continent's few engines of expansion. This shift didn't happen by chance. It started when the government redirected its focus inward, toward food and energy self-reliance under Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For years, insecurity had torn transport routes apart, displaced families, and drained public funds into defense. Aid declined, investors fled, and the international forecast turned grim. Yet instead of collapse, the local markets adapted. Farmers restructured supply chains, mining resumed production, and domestic demand kept circulation alive. The turning point was subtle but decisive. Economic management stopped waiting for foreign relief and began treating resilience as the first form of sovereignty. Ordinary citizens became the anchor. Their ability to keep consuming, trading, and producing prevented the economy from freezing. By the time growth figures were released, the real story had already unfolded beneath them. A system refusing to die and a leader turning survival into strategy. He wasn't an economist, but he understood pressure. Under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's leadership became the compass guiding an economy through chaos. Regional analysts first dismissed the numbers, until field observers confirmed government offices kept working, grain depots reopened, and miners returned to production. The first official to speak publicly described it simply: continuity became our resistance. That sentence revealed everything. A few months later, markets in Ouagadougou revived. Shopkeepers restocked, local fuel deliveries resumed. Each recovery point carried one name behind it: the young captain who refused to let governance stall. And when inflation fell below 2%, even international monitors had to acknowledge that this was no statistical illusion. From that moment, policy experts stopped arguing about if and began asking how. The first observer to draw the map of this recovery called it a sovereignty model in motion. It was neither populism nor isolation, but the act of treating internal strength as infrastructure. From that point onward, no one could claim this was a temporary rebound. The story had crossed the line, from emergency to endurance. It began with disbelief. When the first fiscal reports arrived, even the government's own analysts double-checked the figures. Burkina Faso's economy had expanded when every external signal predicted contraction. The trigger came in early 2025 when the administration, led by Ibrahim Traoré, redirected national budgets toward essential production and food security. That decision rippled fast. Farm cooperatives restarted idle mills. Traders reopened rural markets. Local industries began filling import gaps. Confidence spread faster than aid could arrive. Then came the surge. Gold exports jumped, cotton regained buyers, prices steadied. Each week the data moved upward while regional forecasts kept sinking. Outside observers called it an anomaly. Inside the country, it felt like release. Bureaucrats who once expected collapse started racing to sustain momentum. It was no longer survival, it was acceleration. And after the storm came the stillness of proof. Inflation down, exports up, streets calmer. Families noticed food prices holding steady. The rhythm of trade resumed. Those who had left began returning home to rebuild. The aftershock wasn't destruction, it was a renewal, the kind born only when a nation learns to function under fire. At first glance, the numbers seemed almost too clean, but the deeper one looked, the more they formed a pattern of discipline rather than chance. The 6.3% growth recorded in 2025 was not an isolated surge. It grew from a base that had resisted collapse since late 2024. Public spending, once stretched thin by defense needs, was redirected into productive capacity. Agriculture and mining, the twin engines of the economy, expanded by measurable margins, while inflation fell from 4.2% to 1.8% within 12 months. The first metric proved scale. Exports surpassed 500 billion CFA francs, signaling an economy capable of generating its own foreign earnings. That figure alone redefined the limits of a fragile state. The second metric defined speed. Trade moved from a deficit of 466 billion to a surplus of 1.63 billion CFA francs, a reversal that no regional peer matched. The third metric, quieter but more human, showed the heart of the story. Food prices stabilized, protecting the daily budgets of millions of citizens. That stability did more than ease hardship, it prevented unrest, turning economic policy into a shield for social cohesion. Taken together, the data revealed a coherence impossible to fake. They told of a state that had learned to balance expansion with restraint, growth with survival, and at its core stood a single conviction: that sovereignty begins when a nation feeds, funds, and defends itself from within. Even Traoré's critics had to admit one thing: skepticism was fair. How could a landlocked country fighting insecurity and cut off from donors record one of Africa's fastest growth rates? Two schools of thought emerged. The first claimed that luck and timing had favored Burkina Faso, that global gold prices and a mild harvest masked structural weakness. The second, more serious view argued that policy coherence mattered more than fortune. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the state had redefined sovereignty as a working economic method, not a slogan. Those who doubted the approach pointed to declining aid and limited investment. They warned that without foreign credit, the economy would stall. But fiscal reports showed the opposite. Domestic revenue collection had increased and basic public services continued without external bailouts. Others feared inflation would spike once subsidies tightened. Instead, prices stabilized as internal supply chains strengthened. By mid-2025, the opposition's strongest argument dissolved. Even international monitors who once questioned the data began citing it in regional assessments. Both sides found truth in their claims. External shocks remained a risk, yet internal adaptation had blunted their force. The real takeaway was neither victory nor denial, but evidence. Resilience, when institutionalized, becomes strategy. That recognition shifted the debate from "can it work?" as to "how long can it last?" And then something shifted. What had started as survival turned into momentum. The very crisis that threatened to break the country became its forge. Burkina Faso was no longer reacting, it was redefining the game. A sudden reversal in perception swept through the region. Neighboring states that once pitied its struggle began studying its model. Analysts who dismissed it as an exception started using it as a case study. Under Ibrahim Traoré, self-reliance stopped being rhetoric and became routine. The turning point was not a single policy or headline. It was the quiet alignment of will, resources, and belief. Farmers, civil servants, and traders all moved in rhythm with the same logic: depend less, produce more. And with every quarter, the proof accumulated. From this moment, the story of Burkina Faso stopped being about endurance. It became about transformation, the kind that forces others to ask whether sovereignty can, in fact, be engineered. The results soon moved beyond spreadsheets. They began reshaping lives and hierarchies. For the state, the success meant leverage. Policy credibility rose. External lenders softened their tone. Decision-makers found room to act without waiting for approval from abroad. For businesses, it translated into continuity. Imports of machinery and fuel, worth nearly 3,900 billion CFA francs, no longer felt like survival purchases, but strategic inputs. Local investors re-entered markets once written off as lost. Entrepreneurs saw profit in stability, not speculation. For ordinary citizens, the effect was immediate. Stable food prices turned daily planning from fear into foresight. Families could save again. Small traders reopened stalls. Confidence quietly replaced fatigue. Economic control had become social oxygen. And for the region, the signal was unmistakable. Across the Sahel, governments struggling with debt and insecurity saw in Burkina Faso a mirror of what could be reclaimed. Discussions in ECOWAS corridors mentioned the Traoré approach, a phrase unthinkable just 2 years earlier. No one could now claim the recovery was illusion. Its consequences had names, faces, and figures. Growth in this context had become a statement of existence. If current trends continue, Burkina Faso's path will likely stabilize into a disciplined growth cycle. Production and trade will remain steady, inflation contained, and social cohesion preserved. It's the most probable scenario, resilient, not spectacular, but sustainable. An optimistic outcome is also within reach. If reforms in revenue collection and agriculture deepen, the country could expand its growth base beyond 6%, strengthen regional exports, and reduce debt exposure further. Such a result would mark a rare instance in West Africa, where internal reform overtakes external dependency. Yet the worst-case scenario cannot be ignored. A sudden security relapse or external financial squeeze could erode gains within months, forcing renewed reliance on donors and halting investment confidence. It would not erase progress, but it would test every assumption built since 2025. The lesson, however, is simple. Resilience must be maintained, not celebrated. Predicting the future matters less than preparing for it, and every policy from here on will decide whether Ibrahim Traoré's economic revolution endures or fades. After all the figures and forecasts, one question remains: what does this mean for those watching? If you followed the story this far, you've already seen what discipline and defiance can achieve under impossible odds. Now it's about you, the observer in this equation. For those who study and care about African development, this case is an insight into how internal reform can outpace external aid. Keep watching the data. It's rewriting economic orthodoxy. For those affected indirectly, through business, trade, or security, it's a signal to prepare. Resilient economies shift the balance of partnerships, and Burkina Faso is altering that balance fast. And for those who once thought this didn't concern them, silence is no longer neutral. The world's economic maps are changing, and the difference risks being left behind. Whichever group you belong to, one truth stands. Understanding Ibrahim Traoré's experiment means not just following a leader, but witnessing a new definition of strength. Talk is never enough, not when an entire model of governance is being tested in real time. So what comes next must be measured in action, not applause. Step 1. The state must keep strengthening domestic production, agriculture, energy, and mining, while maintaining fiscal discipline. Success will be visible in steady exports and stable prices. Step 2. Business sectors should expand regional trade routes and invest in processing capacity, ensuring that raw materials translate into local value. Progress can be tracked through export diversification and job retention. Step 3. Citizens and communities can contribute through small practical shifts, supporting local producers, reducing dependence on imported goods, and sustaining civic trust in public programs. Optionally, regional cooperation could deepen this momentum. Joint food reserves, cross-border infrastructure, and shared energy networks would turn resilience into a collective defense. Because the truth is clear, Plans only matter when carried out. Burkina Faso's next victory won't come from slogans, but from each layer of society executing what the data already proved possible. It circles back to where it began, with a man who refused collapse as destiny. When Ibrahim Traoré first spoke of self-reliance, even allies called it naive. Now, after years of discipline and proof, his words echo differently. The same offices that once braced for shutdown now pulse with work. The same farmers who feared hunger now feed their markets. And the same numbers that once seemed impossible now define a nation's recovery. From the first doubt to the last report, Burkina Faso walked through scarcity, pressure, and disbelief, and came out not unscarred but unbroken. Its journey turned policy into pulse, strategy into sustenance, and survival into meaning. In that transformation lies the emotional truth. Growth here was not just economic, but human. And when a country learns to build stability from within, even fragility becomes a form of strength. Endurance became identity. Every story eventually becomes a shared one. This isn't just about numbers, or even about Ibrahim Traoré himself. It's about what happens when a society decides to trust its own capacity to rebuild. If this story moved you, if it made you see the Sahel not as a place of crisis but of renewal, then let it travel further. Share it so others understand that resilience is not a miracle, it's a method. Tell it so that those who still doubt can see what conviction looks like when measured in results. And perhaps ask yourself, what lesson does this hold for your own community, your own choices, your own version of the sovereignty? Because understanding is only the first step. Conversation is the bridge that keeps it alive. And through that dialogue, stories like Burkina Faso's stop being exceptions. They become possibilities. The applause faded quickly, as it always does when history is still unfolding. By early 2026, international observers began sending new delegations to Ouagadougou, this time not to lecture, but to learn. What they found was not a miracle economy, it was a system of pragmatic endurance, built brick by brick during years of crisis. Behind closed doors, policy briefings described it as the most disciplined improvisation in the region. Diplomats noted something subtle but profound. Ibrahim Traoré's government didn't reject cooperation. It reframed it. Burkina Faso began choosing its partners instead of being chosen, prioritizing resource control and trade over dependence on external aid. That shift altered how negotiations felt. Each meeting carried an air of regained symmetry. For the first time in decades, the country was speaking from stability, not from scarcity. In regional forums, younger leaders referenced the Ouagadougou precedent. They debated whether resilience could truly be replicated without Traoré's political will or Burkina's social cohesion. Some saw the model as fragile, a balance that could falter with one wrong policy turn. Others saw it as a blueprint for an entire belt of nations redefining sovereignty through function, not theory. History will decide which reading prevails. But for now, the lesson remains. Endurance, when institutionalized, becomes power. And that power, if guided wisely, could shift Africa's center of gravity one policy at a time. In private conversations across West Africa, ministers began to ask a quiet question. What if the Traoré method scales? No grand doctrine was announced, yet its traces appeared everywhere. In Niger's push for domestic fuel refinement, in Mali's investment in local grain storage, in Guinea's experiments with community-based credit systems. Each was different in form, but shared the same undercurrent, the will to stand without leaning. Observers in European capitals initially dismissed this trend as short-term nationalism, but by mid-2026, economic bulletins began describing a Sahel supply loop, an informal network of trade, production, and resource sharing that reduced dependence on traditional donors. At its quiet center stood Burkina Faso, still modest, still scarred, but undeniably stable. Ibrahim Traoré never claimed ownership of the idea. When asked about it in a rare interview, he replied, "We only remember that dignity is not an import." That line spread faster than any policy memo. It was quoted in speeches from Dakar to N'Djamena. What began as a survival plan had become a school of thought. The paradox deepened. The more Burkina Faso looked inward, the more its influence expanded outward. No empire, no propaganda, just a functioning proof that autonomy can be contagious. And perhaps that, more than any statistic, is the real revolution. By the start of 2027, the ripple had reached places far beyond the Sahel. Economic journals in Asia began referring to the Traoré variable, a shorthand for the balance between sovereignty and survival. It wasn't about ideology anymore, it was about design. How to build growth that breathes under pressure, how to anchor stability when external certainty no longer exists. Inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere felt calmer but not complacent. Officials spoke less about reform and more about rhythm, keeping the machinery moving, however imperfectly. Rural cooperatives expanded irrigation, mining companies reinvested in processing, and small enterprises multiplied where 8 projects once stood. For the first time in years, people measured success in continuity, not recovery. Ibrahim Traoré rarely appeared on television. He preferred quiet visits to farms and factories, away from ceremony. His absence from headlines became its own message. Authority no longer needed spectacle to exist. Where his name once symbolized resistance, it now carried a subtler weight: stewardship. International analysts struggle to categorize this phase. It wasn't growth by textbook, nor populism by design. It was something rarer. An economy that had learned to function like a living organism, adjusting to shocks without breaking form. Perhaps in the end, that's what the world missed while watching Burkina Faso rise. It wasn't chasing miracles. It was simply remembering how to stay alive and turning that instinct into structure. The story comes full circle in silence, not spectacle. Burkina Faso no longer needs to prove that it can endure. It simply does. Markets open at dawn, farmers trade under the same sun that once scorched their fear, and government reports arrive on time. Unremarkable, steady, alive. That ordinariness is the victory. Outside, the world still debates the numbers, still doubts what discipline and scarcity can build. But inside, a quiet confidence has taken root, not the pride of triumph, but the calm of self-knowledge. The nation has learned that sovereignty isn't a declaration. It's a habit renewed every day. Ibrahim Traoré remains both symbol and servant of that idea. His leadership no longer needs slogans or speeches to resonate. Each functioning school, each stable price, each field that yields on time is part of his argument. History, it seems, is written not by miracles, but by maintenance. And so the revolution ends as it began, in the daily rhythm of work, in a people who refuse to surrender their right to persist. No flags raised, no fanfare, only a steady heartbeat beneath the dust, proving that survival, when perfected, becomes peace.